All right, what we all want to talk about. I'm going to be quick on this one because I'm hoping everybody's pretty much up to speed, but I think a quick update would be a good idea. So on the fiduciary rule, we recently just had an extension. It was scheduled to end on January 1st, 2018, but now with the extension, it's July 1st of 2019. This is the transition period that we're currently in. But everybody understands that the best interest standard, which is one of the impartial conduct standards, is in place as we speak. So that went into place June of this year. They're re-examining the fiduciary rule and see if any changes are warranted. But as of June 9th, everything that went into effect, June 9th of 2017, this year, remains in effect. It's just they're extending the transition period. So during this transition period, you really have two choices from a liability standpoint of how you're treating, your responsibilities or where liability lies. For example, Prosperity Capital Advisors, as an RIA, all of our investment advisor representatives, we put them under transition BIC, meaning that we took over the liability. Many of your broker dealers probably did the same thing. So your liability is borne by your broker dealer. We are the only RIA, at least Allianz has told us that of all the RIAs in the country that they deal with, we're the only one that took on the liability for our IARs for their indexed annuity sales. All of the other RIAs forced the IARs to go under 8424. And so 8424, you as the advisor, you're the one taking on that liability. Under transition BIC, the financial institution's taking on that liability. Why did we do that? Because we're that confident in our best interest process. In the bucket plan best interest process, we're that confident that it meets the best interest standard that we're willing to take on the liability for all of our IARs. Annuities and insurance contracts can be sold under the transitional BIC if a financial institution agrees to be the fiduciary for the sale. You must still adhere to the impartial conduct standards under the transitional BIC. So there's three of them. Number one is reasonable compensation. So your financial institution has to make sure that you're only receiving reasonable compensation. Now, again, Prosperity Capital Advisors is an example, and C2P Advisory Group, we have our best interest product shelf, and we screen the annuities that you're able to represent. And so therefore, we're making sure the compensation is reasonable. And so again, we're willing, because we have a best interest product shelf and we screen all the annuities in the industry, we're comfortable taking on that liability for our IARs because we're doing the screening. Secondly, no misleading statements. For any of you that are your own RIAs or you're in a situation where you're doing 8424, you really want to be taking close looks at your websites. That's the biggest area that our legal counsel's telling us that advisors have liability is their website and as the potential is misleading statements. We're looking at all your websites, for the IARs. And the best interest standard. The best interest standard is the one that's the trickiest. It has the most kind of moving parts and somewhat of a gray area, but that's what our best interest process is in place for. Under 8424, as I mentioned, you're the fiduciary. You must still adhere to the impartial conduct standards under 8424, just like under transitional BIC. 8424, though, actually has more requirements than the transitional BIC does, such as you have to disclose your compensation. Therefore, if you're sitting in front of a client and you sell an annuity and you're under 8424 because your RIA had you go under 8424, for example, or some broker dealers are having even their registered reps, they're saying outside business activity, you take the liability as the agent, and they're under 8424. If you're under that, you need to be providing the disclosure. You have to disclose your compensation as a percentage of premium. So if you sell a $100,000 annuity at 7% commission, you have to disclose that to the client of the compensation that you're making on that sale. So full disclosure of any conflicts of interest, also if you're under 8424. And then the signed disclosure, so that all that being disclosed has to be signed by the client, and then you have to keep it on file in your own personal office for 6 years. So actually 8424 is a little bit more challenging in regards to record keeping and some of the things that you have to adhere to as an agent selling indexed annuities under 8424 or fixed annuities. There's a non-enforcement policy. So there's a big misconception in the industry because, the DOL has said they're not going to pursue claims against fiduciaries during the extension period, as well as the IRS has also said they're not going to enforce it right now. And that part is true. But a lot of advisors say, oh, well, we're in the clear. We don't really need to worry about meeting a best interest standard or not having misleading statements or only receiving reasonable compensation because they're not enforcing it. But see, number one, they state that it only applies if you are working diligently and in good faith to comply with the rule. So number one, you got to be able to exhibit that you're working diligently to apply, to conform to the rule. But the DOL and the IRS determines that if you're not making good faith effort to comply, they will enforce the rules. But most importantly, the policy does not prevent private enforcement of the rules, meaning that we can be sued. We can be sued by clients for not meeting the best interest standard, having misleading statements, or receiving compensation that's not deemed reasonable. So that's very important to understand because there's a misconception because they're not enforcing it under DOL and IRS that we're kind of in the clear and we're not. So this is in fact June 9th, and it's something we all need to be very cognizant of. The impartial conduct standards, recently Brad Campbell, which is Drinker Biddle's one of the law firms that we consult with, and he's the former Assistant Secretary of Labor for Employee Benefits and head of the Employee Benefits Securities Administration for the DOL. This is basically the office that oversees a lot of the enforcement of the fiduciary rule. So the statement he just recently made in a correspondence with us, we do not think it likely that we will see the elimination of impartial conduct standards. So the impartial conduct standards, again, reasonable compensation, no misleading statements, and meeting a best interest standard. This is the general consensus of the industry. All the financial institutions that I've spoke with and all the experts in the industry and any research I've done, the general consensus is the best interest standard, the impartial conduct standards, those aren't going away. And so, don't put your head in the sand and say, oh, well, this DOL thing, this is just going to blow over. It's not. And so taking the action that you need to take to make sure you're meeting a best interest standard is more important than ever. So what is the best interest standard? The best we can do is pull the exact wording out of the DOL fiduciary rule. Now, we had the dots are where we cut out a bunch of legalese, but to kind of condense these statements to understand what they actually mean. But in general, there's three components to the best interest standard in its definition. Number one is prudence. The care, skill, prudence, and diligence that a prudent person familiar with such matters would use. So what does that really mean? Well, there's a statement to do with this in the fiduciary rule, and what it says is, a pure heart and an empty head are not enough. You better know what you're doing. You better know what you're doing, and you can't claim that I didn't know better you better get educated. You better actually know what you're doing with the client. Second component, individualization. Based on the investment objectives, risk tolerance, financial circumstances, and needs of the retirement investor. Fundamentals of financial planning. Fundamentals of financial planning. The DOL is basically saying under the fiduciary rule, under the best interest standard, we need to be doing financial planning. And loyalty, without regard to the financial or other interest of the advisor. So the loyalty provision, what that's saying is you roll over $1 million out of an account, or let's say from a 401k, and you better be able to document and justify why you put X amount of dollars into an annuity to earn 7% versus 1% ongoing in assets under management. And on the flip side, if you're an AUM guy and you don't use annuities much, you better be able to justify and document why you rolled 100% of the money over into an AUM account, 1%, not just because you're going to make the 1% forever. You better be able to document why you used the AUM account and you didn't incorporate any annuity if the client is telling you they want to be more conservative with a portion of their assets. So it's very important to have that documentation to be able to prove the loyalty standard, in my opinion. So these three components are what make up the best interest standard. What do we do? I think everybody in this room knows what we do as a solution. We have the bucket plan best interest process, which is really our 1.0 version. It's the bare bones of what you have to do to meet the best interest standard from a data gathering and documentation purpose. And having that investment planning statement signed at the end that consolidates all the most important information to prove we met the best interest standard is a key component of that documentation. And then we have the holistic planning process. That's an overlay training. So that's where you've really mastered the best interest process, the bucket plan 1.0, and now you want to take it to the next level and start incorporating charging planning fees, building service models, doing the family estate organizer, the step 4 annual review process. All the additional things that we teach in the holistic planning is overlay on top of the foundation of the bucket plan best interest process. So we've started certifying advisors. We've had 193 advisors get certified so far this year in the bucket plan best interest process. If you haven't yet in the room, if you haven't came through that, it's a day-and-a-half experiential training. It's where we have you take the online course as a prerequisite. It's only a few hours long. You take a quick examination to know that you retained the information you needed to, and then you come through the live training where we teach the concept or the tool, and then we actually have you use the scripts, the tools, and we have you break off in two and role play, and then we do a group discussion, and then we do it again. We teach a concept or tool, we have you break off in two and role play, and then we have a group discussion. We do that over and over for a day and a half. And by the end of that day and a half, you're going to come out of that training with full capability and confidence that you can meet that best interest standard. The next training is January 31st and February 1st in Cleveland. Maybe we'll go snowmobiling or sledding. All right. And the 2.0 training, if you've already come through the 1.0, is for the holistic planning, the overlay of the additional training is January 17th and 18th is our next session for that. So if you're interested in those, talk to your business development partner and they can help you out with that.